She braced herself for a thief. She had rehearsed the scene in her mind for a fortnight, a ragged stranger, a sack of stolen bread, the cold satisfaction of catching him in the act. Instead, crouched in the shadow of her own still-room door with a lantern shuttered against the wind, she found something that would not fit into any ledger of crime she knew, and the discovery would cost her far more than the missing hams and flour ever had. It had begun, as these things often do, with arithmetic. The larders of a great house are supposed to answer to numbers. So many sacks of grain laid in at Michaelmas, so many hams smoked and hung, so much butter churned and salted against the long gray months. A duchess who cannot balance her own kitchen accounts is a duchess inviting whispers, and whispers, in a house already gnawed thin by debt, were a luxury she could not afford. For 3 weeks the numbers had refused to hold still. Bread vanished by the loaf. Fish meant for the servants' table thinned to bones and broth. Someone was feeding themselves from her failing house, and failing houses, she had learned young, cannot afford charity they did not choose. Marriages among the nobility are not made in heaven. Neither, she had discovered, is housekeeping. Both are ledgers, dressed up as devotion. So she had waited. She had told no one, not the housekeeper, not the steward, certainly not the staff who already regarded her with the particular pity reserved for a plain woman married for her father's coin rather than her face. She had sat 3 nights running in the cold pantry, with a shawl pulled tight and a lantern unlit, listening to the sea grind against the cliffs below the house, counting down, though she could not yet have said toward what, the hours until the thief revealed himself. On the 3rd night he did. She heard the door before she saw him, the particular groan of old hinges she had complained of once, in passing, to no one who seemed to be listening. Then the shape of him in the doorway, broad-shouldered and quiet-footed, a man she had passed 100 times on the grounds without truly seeing, the groundskeeper, young for the weathering in his face, his coat too thin for the wind coming off the water. He was not filling his own sack. He was dividing loaves into smaller portions, wrapping fish in cloth, his movements practiced and unhurried, a man doing arithmetic of his own. Behind him, half hidden in the dark of the kitchen yard, small faces watched with the particular patience of children who have learned that hunger rewards silence. She should have called for the steward. She should have summoned the magistrate at first light, as any duchess protecting her name would have done. Instead, she stood very still in the doorway, lantern unlit in her hand, and understood, with the cold clarity of a woman who has spent her whole life being overlooked, that she had just found something far more dangerous than a thief. 3 weeks before that door groaned open on its complaining hinge, the house had already begun its slow arithmetic of ruin, and she had begun hers. The estate sat above the Cornish coast like a woman past her prime, who has not yet been told, all fine bones and crumbling plaster, its west wing shuttered against a roof that wept in every rain, its ballroom given over to dust sheets and mice. The wind came off the water without manners, finding every gap in the stone, every ill-fitted casement, and it had long since stopped pretending to be seasonal. It simply was, the way debt simply was, the way widowhood simply was, a permanent weather she had learned to dress for. Her husband had left her a title and very little else, a name still spoken with a certain reverence in London drawing-rooms, and a ledger of obligations that made the reverence feel like a cruel joke. Marriages among the nobility are not forged in heaven, they are negotiated in drawing-rooms, and hers had been negotiated badly, though she had not known it at the time, had not known, until the solicitors came with their black coats and their careful eyes, how thoroughly a man could mortgage a future he did not intend to live to see. What remained was a house too large to heat, a staff too loyal to dismiss, and a larder she counted like a general counting powder before a siege she suspected was already lost. It was the larder that first told her something was wrong. She had always kept a private tally, a habit from girlhood, from a childhood where counting had meant the difference between supper and its absence, and so she noticed, the way one notices a missing button before a missing coat, that the bread was disappearing faster than any household of her diminished size should account for. A loaf here, a wedge of cheese there, fish that had been salted for the month, gone in a fortnight. She said nothing to the housekeeper, whose loyalty she trusted, nor to the steward, whose arithmetic she did not. She simply began, quietly, to watch. A woman overlooked her whole life learns certain skills by necessity, and chief among them is patience, the particular patience of someone who has never been the one asked to speak first, and so has become expert at listening instead. She watched the kitchen door, she watched the tide charts, the moon, the nights when the household slept heaviest. She told herself she was protecting what little remained of her name, her husband's memory, her right to call this ruin of a house her own. She did not yet know that in 3 nights' time, standing in a doorway with an unlit lantern, she would find not a thief to prosecute, but a debt of an entirely different kind, one that no ledger she owned could properly measure, and one the coming days would demand she pay in full. 3 nights. She had given herself 3 nights to be certain, though certainty was a luxury she could no longer afford in most areas of her life, and she suspected she was affording it now only because the alternative, accusation without proof, was a cruelty she could not bring herself to commit. Marriages among the nobility are not forged in heaven, neither is justice among servants forged in suspicion alone. She had learned that much from a husband who had ruled his household by decree and left her, at his death, a title heavier than any comfort it provided. She had seen him before, of course. One does not live 3 years in a house and fail to notice the man who keeps its grounds, though she had never truly looked, not the way she looked now, standing at her window past midnight, watching him cross the frost-silvered lawn toward the kitchen garden with a sack over one shoulder. He moved like a man accustomed to carrying weight without complaint. He was young, younger than she had first assumed, his face aged more by weather and worry than by years, and handsome in the unremarkable way of men who have never been given cause to think of their own faces at all. His hands, when she had once seen them gripping a spade, were scarred and cracked from labor, the nails blackened permanently at the edges, the kind of hands that had never known idleness and likely never would. He was quiet in the way of men who have learned that speech is often a cost they cannot afford. She had exchanged perhaps a dozen words with him in 3 years, instructions about the hedgerows, a query about the drainage near the east wall, and each time he had answered with a brevity that seemed less rudeness than economy, as though even his voice were rationed. Vermin, the housekeeper had suggested, not unkindly. Gulls, grown bold with hunger, the steward had offered, eager to close the matter and return to his ledgers. She had let them believe she accepted these explanations, because a duchess who trusts her staff's incompetence is safer, in certain rooms, than one who trusts her own eyes. But she had counted the loaves herself. She had weighed the cheese. Gulls did not fold coats to muffle footsteps on gravel, and vermin did not choose, with such peculiar consistency, only the freshest bread and never the stale. She resolved, that 3rd night, to sit awake in the cold dark of the larder passage with no lantern lit, only the moon coming thin through the high window, and wait, not for a servant's gossip to resolve itself, not for morning to explain what darkness concealed, but for the truth to walk toward her on its own 2 feet, as it always eventually does, however long a woman is made to wait for it. The moon kept its promise. It came thin and cold through the high window of the larder passage, laying a pale rectangle upon the flagstones, and she sat within the dark beyond it as though she herself were a piece of the night's furniture. An hour passed, then another. Marriages among the nobility are not forged in heaven, she thought. They are negotiated in drawing rooms. And perhaps that was why she had grown so practiced at waiting in silence for men to reveal what they would not say aloud. She had waited 3 years for a husband's letters that grew shorter and colder until they stopped. She could wait one more night for a thief. The door did not creak. That itself told her something. Hinges do not oil themselves, and someone had troubled to oil this one, quietly, deliberately, over what must have been many nights of practice. A shape moved through the pale rectangle of moonlight, not furtive, not stumbling, but economical. The same economy she had noted in his brevity, in the way he answered questions about drainage, as though every word cost him something he could not spare. He crossed to the shelf where the fresh loaves sat cooling under their cloths, and he did not grab, did not hurry, but chose 2 loaves, a wedge of hard cheese, a paper twist of salted fish taken from the barrel, with the careful reverence of a man handling something holy. She rose from the dark. She had rehearsed this moment for 3 days, the cold recitation of theft and dismissal, the words a duchess is entitled to when her stores are plundered by her own staff. But when he turned and saw her, when his face went the color of tallow and his hands closed instinctively around the sack as though he might still protect its contents from her, even now, even caught, the words did not come. What came instead was a question she had not rehearsed at all. "Where?" she said, very quietly. "Are you taking my bread?" He did not answer. He only looked at her the way a man looks at a magistrate he expects will hang him by morning, and then, astonishingly, he turned toward the servants' door and walked out into the night, not running, not pleading, simply walking, as though her silence had been a kind of permission, or as though he had decided that whatever came next, he would not beg for it. She should have called for the steward. She should have rung for the housekeeper and had him bound until morning, brought the magistrate's clerk from the village. Instead, she found her own feet moving after him, her wrapper gathered against the wind coming up off the water, following a stranger's back down the cliff path in the dark, toward a sound she could not yet name, the sea, and something smaller beneath it, thin and human, drifting up from the cove like a question she had not known to ask. The path down was treacherous even by daylight, and she had walked it only twice before, both times on the arm of a husband long dead, both times in shoes better suited to it than the thin slippers she wore now. She did not turn back. 60 hours, she had told herself upstairs, watching the magistrate's letter curl in the grate. Now she could not have said how many remained. She had stopped counting the moment her feet found the path, and there was something almost merciful in that forgetting. The cove opened before her the way a secret opens before someone who has stumbled upon it by accident and cannot now unknow it. A fire, banked low and shielded from the wind by a half-collapsed fisherman's shed. Shapes around it, small shapes, thin shapes, huddled in what looked like sailcloth and old grain sacks, stitched together with more patience than skill. She counted without meaning to. 12. 12 children, none past the age of 10, none looking at her, all looking at him. He knelt among them as though kneeling were the natural business of his body, and perhaps by now it was. He broke the bread himself, tearing it into pieces small enough for the smallest mouths, and gave the heel, the driest, hardest part, the part a groundskeeper might reasonably keep for himself, to a girl who could not have been more than 4, wrapping her fingers around it with his own, as though her hands were not yet clever enough to hold what little the world had offered her. He did not speak much. He did not need to. There was a rhythm to it, a practiced, unglamorous tenderness that told her this was not the first night, nor the 5th, nor even the 20th, that whatever she had lost from her larders these past weeks had gone toward exactly this and nothing else. A duchess is taught, from the cradle, to recognize theft, ingratitude, ruin. She is taught rather less about recognizing grace, and so it took her longer than it should have to understand what she was watching. One of the boys began to cough, the deep, wet cough of a chest that had known too many wet nights, and he was there before the sound had finished, pressing a flask to the boy's lips, murmuring something she could not hear over the tide. The plan she had carried down the cliff, the summons, the magistrate, the tidy restoration of order, dissolved somewhere between the fire and the sound of that cough, the way frost dissolves on a hand held too near a flame. She stood at the edge of the firelight a long while before he noticed her. When he did not reach for the sack this time, nor for any excuse. He only looked at her, waiting, the way a man waits for a sentence he has already decided he deserves. She did not give him one. Instead, she said, "You are doing this wrong." He blinked at her, the firelight catching the surprise before he could smooth it away. A man accustomed to being caught braces for accusation, not correction, and so for a moment he simply stood there, sack half lowered, as though she had spoken in a language he was still translating. "The bread is stale," she said, "and there is not nearly enough of it. 12 children cannot live on crusts and good intentions." "No, Your Grace," he said carefully, "they cannot." She did not ask him to stop. This, more than anything, seemed to unmoor him further, for a woman with any sense of her own consequence would have marched him back up the cliff path by the collar of his coat and let the magistrate sort out the rest. Instead, she crouched, ruinous to her hem, and began dividing what remained of the bread more evenly among the smallest hands, murmuring instructions about broth and barley as though she had done this her whole life instead of never having done it at all. Duchess is taught to give from a distance, a coin pressed into a glove, a basket left at a door, never to kneel in the wet sand beside the poor and measure their hunger with her own hands. By the following dawn she had brought a ledger. It was a small thing, bound in plain leather, the kind a housekeeper might use to record candle wax and coal, and into it she began writing, in a careful hand that betrayed none of the trembling she felt doing it. 2 loaves, dispensed by order of the Duchess. A jar of preserves, dispensed by order of the Duchess. She wrote the words by order of the Duchess each time, deliberately, the way one presses a seal into wax, and she did not tell him why, though he watched her write it the 3rd morning and understood, without being told, that she was building something. A ledger is a small thing. It is also, in the right hands, an alibi. "You needn't come again," he told her, not for the first time, as the tide crept toward their ankles and the children scattered back toward the village with their pockets full. "I am aware of what I needn't do," she said. "I have come anyway." He did not argue further. There is a particular exhaustion in a man who has spent his life expecting to be refused. And when refusal does not come, he learns, slowly, painfully, to stop flinching at its absence. Each morning she brought a little more, oats hoarded from her own breakfast tray, a heel of cheese slipped into her pocket at supper, and each entry went into the ledger in her own hand, until the little book had become, without either of them quite naming it, a record not of theft but of will. She did not yet know how soon she would need it, nor how dearly. The fence along the eastern paddock had been broken since autumn, since before either of them had thought to notice the other, and one morning she found it mended, not announced, not remarked upon, simply whole, the new wood pale as a scar against the weathered gray of the old. She did not ask when he had done it. She had learned by then that a man who feeds a village at midnight does not advertise his hours. There is a kind of courtship that never once uses the word, that instead repairs what is broken and waits to see if it is noticed. She noticed everything. In return, she began leaving a plate. It was a small thing, covered with a cloth against the flies, set on the stone ledge by the kitchen door where the scullery maids would not think to look, and the housekeeper would not think to ask. Cold mutton, sometimes an egg, once, extravagantly, foolishly, a wedge of the seed cake meant for the vicar's visit, which she cut thin so its absence would not be marked. He never spoke of it either, but the plate was always empty by evening, scrubbed clean and set back exactly where he had found it, as though even his gratitude wished to leave no trace. A house runs on unspoken accounting, and theirs had become its own private ledger, separate from the one locked in her writing desk, a debt of small mercies paid back and forth so quietly that neither party could have named the sum, only felt, each day, that it grew. There were evenings, when the frost came early off the water and the kitchen fire burned low and orange, that she found reason to linger there past what her rank required, ostensibly to review the household accounts, in truth because the warmth of that particular hearth had begun to feel less like charity extended downward and more like company offered sideways, between equals who had simply never been permitted to say so. He would sit at the far end of the bench, mending a harness or oiling a boot, and neither of them spoke for the better part of an hour, and the silence was not the silence of strangers. Marriage, she had been taught, was a contract witnessed by solicitors. She was coming to suspect that the truer contracts were witnessed by no one at all, only firelight, and the small unspoken agreement to keep showing up. She did not call it courtship. He did not call it anything. But the days were passing now with a weight she had not felt before, each one folding into the ledger like a stone, added to a wall not yet tall enough to keep out whatever was coming toward it from the road. And something, she felt it in her bones before she had any proof of it, was already on its way. The gathering had been small, 4 families from the neighboring parishes, invited less for pleasure than for the maintenance of appearances, since a duchess who never entertained invited more suspicion than one who did. The drawing-room was cold despite the fire, and the tea was thin, and everyone at the table understood the thinness without remarking on it, because cruelty in polite company rarely announces itself. It waits. It smiles first. It was the steward from the neighboring estate, a heavy-set man with a laugh too large for the room, who did the waiting longest. He complimented the china. He complimented the weather. Then, setting down his cup with the precision of a man who had rehearsed the gesture, he complimented the Duchess's economy. One hears the larders here run remarkably lean, Your Grace, practically monastic. Some might call it thrift. Others, he let the pause do its work, might wonder if a house so plain in its table matches a mistress so plain in her face. The laughter that followed was polite, which made it worse. Politeness is cruelty wearing gloves. The Duchess did not flinch, because she had long ago taught her face the discipline of stillness, a lesson learned in ballrooms before this one, from mouths crueler than his. She lifted her cup. She said nothing. Silence, she had learned, could be its own answer, though it rarely satisfied a room hungry for blood. It was the groundskeeper who broke first, not with violence, not even with volume, but with a quiet correction delivered from where he stood near the door, having been summoned in to report on the drainage of the lower fields, a servant's errand that should have kept him mute and invisible. The table is lean, sir, because the Duchess has given the surplus elsewhere, he said, in a voice that did not rise but did not waver either. "There are children on the shore who eat because of it. I'd not call that thrift. I'd not call it plain either." The room went silent in the other direction now, the silence of people recalculating. A steward did not correct a gathering of his betters, a groundskeeper did so even less. And yet he had done it looking not at the man he addressed but at her, briefly, before returning his eyes to the floor as propriety demanded, too briefly for accusation, long enough for notice. A servant who forgets his place has usually remembered something more important than it lay, the Duchess thought, and the thought frightened her more than the insult had. The neighbors left an hour later with their carriages and their gossip both loaded. Nothing had been proven, nothing needed to be. A groundskeeper defending his mistress's honor was the kind of detail that traveled faster than any road, and further, faster even, than the letter that was already, at that very hour, being sealed in a magistrate's stadily across the county, into a drawer, and out again into a satchel bound for the coast road. He arrived on a Tuesday, which the Duchess would remember afterward, as the ordinary sort of day that precedes ruin. No thunder, no crows, only a gray drizzle and the smell of wet gravel. He did not send word ahead. Magistrates rarely do. Surprise is a tool, like a key or a blade, and he meant to use it. He was announced by the butler in a tone reserved for weather one cannot argue with, and he came into the hall shaking rain from his hat, with the particular briskness of a man who believes his own time more valuable than anyone else's peace. He did not sit when offered a chair. He produced instead a leather folio, and from it, papers, columns of figures in a clerk's careful hand, sums that did not resolve themselves the way sums are meant to. Money, like water, finds the crack in anything it is poured into. The narrator might have said, and here was the crack, laid bare on a mahogany table between them, flour unaccounted for, fish purchased and not eaten by the household, a larder that emptied faster than any register of guests could explain. "Missing stores, Your Grace," he said, and there was no cruelty in it, only the flat satisfaction of a man who has found what he came to find. "Irregularities, going back some weeks. I am obliged to ask how an estate of your size comes to feed, by my reckoning, considerably more mouths than reside in it." She did not flinch, though something behind her ribs turned over slowly, like a stone in a riverbed. She had known this hour would come. She had simply hoped it would come later, or not at all, the way one hopes for rain to hold off on washing day, knowing all the while that the sky does not bargain. "There are explanations," she said. "Then you have 3 days to furnish them," he answered, not unkindly, but with the particular finality of a door closing on a well-oiled hinge, smooth, complete, no argument left in the wood. "After that, I return with authority to examine your books formally, and your household with them. I would not wish, Your Grace, to make a scandal of a lady's kitchen, but a magistrate who ignores a discrepancy this size does himself no favors, and neither does the lady who cannot explain it." He left his card upon the table, as though the matter were already a debt owed, and took his leave into the drizzle with the folio tucked beneath his arm. Patient, procedural, entirely unmoved. The clock in the hall struck the hour behind him, and the Duchess stood listening to it, as though counting something far larger than minutes. He came to her that night the way he did everything, quietly, without ceremony, as if loudness were a luxury poor men could not afford. She was in the study when she heard the knock, soft as a moth against glass, and she knew before she opened the door that he had not come about the hinge, or the accounts, or anything so small. He stood in the doorway with his cap in his hands, turning it the way men turn things when their hands need an occupation their mouths do not have. "I mean to go to him tonight," he said. "Before the 3 days are spent. I'll tell him it was mine alone. The larder, the boat, all of it. I'll be gone from the estate by morning, and there'll be nothing left for him to find against you." A marriage, and a life beside it, is sometimes built less on vows than on the small treasons people commit against their own safety for one another. And here was his, offered plainly, as though it cost him nothing, when it would cost him everything. "No," she said. "Your Grace, no." She said it again, quieter, and stepped closer, so that the candlelight caught the tiredness under his eyes, the same tiredness she had seen in the mirror that morning and pretended not to recognize. "You will not vanish into some magistrate's ledger as a confessed thief, so that I might keep my name clean. I did not ask you to feed those children so that you might hang for it in my place." "It was never hanging," he said. "Transportation, perhaps. A quiet ruin. Nothing so dramatic as you're imagining." "Ruin does not require drama to be ruin," she said. "It only requires that it happen to someone who cannot afford it. And you, of all the souls on this estate, can least afford it." He looked at her a long moment, and something in his face, guarded these many weeks, closed like a fist, seemed to loosen, though he did not smile. "I only meant to spare you. I know what you meant." Her voice softened, without her quite permitting it to. "But I will not be spared at your expense. Not this, not you." The clock in the hall, that same relentless instrument that had counted the magistrate's departure, struck the half-hour, and she felt the sound of it land in her chest like a struck nail. 3 days had been a mercy of language only. In truth, it was hours now, the sand nearly through the glass, and whatever she meant to do, whatever ledger, whatever confession, whatever quiet, unglamorous defiance she was already assembling in the back rooms of her mind, would have to be done before the sun rose twice more. "Go to bed," she told him, though she did not mean it unkindly. "Whatever comes tomorrow, you will not face it alone. That much I have decided, and I do not mean to be argued out of it." He did not go to bed. She knew this without being told it, the way one knows a storm has broken somewhere out at sea before the first gust reaches the house, by a stillness that is not peace but preparation. And she herself did not sleep, but sat at her writing desk with the candle burned to a stub, the ledger open before her, its pages thick with the small, exact accounting of every loaf and fish she had, in her own hand, ordered given away. It was not a confession she was drafting. It was already written. It had been written, quietly, for weeks, in the margins of ordinary days, and she understood now that she had been preparing this defense long before she had known she would need one. That is the peculiar mercy of habit. It arms us for battles we have not yet been told we must fight. The morning came gray and salt-scented, the sea fog lying low along the cliffs, as though it too were reluctant to witness what the day required. The staff assembled in the hall at her instruction, not summoned by scandal, but by her own quiet command, delivered the night before to the housekeeper with a steadiness that brooked no argument. She wore, deliberately, no finery, only her plainest gown, her hair severely dressed, the ledger held against her breast like a shield that had already done its work simply by existing. The magistrate arrived precisely at the appointed hour, punctual as debt collectors and undertakers, his carriage wheels grinding gravel that had not yet dried from the night's rain. He came in expecting a thief to sentence and a duchess to humble by association, 2 birds, 1 modest stone. He did not get the chance to speak first. "Before you begin," she said, and her voice did not shake, though her hands, hidden in the ledger's pages, did. "You should know that there has been no theft on this estate. Only obedience." She opened the book. She read, in a clear, unhurried voice, the dates, the quantities, the signatures, her own, over and over, an unbroken chain of authorship. Every loaf, every fish, every measure of grain given to the children below the cliffs was given upon my direct written order. The groundskeeper carried out my instructions, nothing more. A marriage among the nobility, the wry old truth goes, is a treaty first and a tenderness only by accident. But a woman's name, once pledged to a thing greater than her own comfort, becomes a currency she may spend as she chooses. She was spending hers now, in full view of the staff, of the fog, of the magistrate's narrowing eyes. He studied her a long moment, weighing, perhaps, whether there was profit in ruining a duchess over bread and fish, and finding, as men of his sort usually do when charity offers no scandal worth its ink, that there was none. He closed his own ledger with a dry, unceremonious snap. "Then there is no crime here to answer for," he said, stiffly, already turning toward the door, already